Hi everybody, welcome to another Chats with Chaudhry. It's a wet, cloudy day here in Surrey this morning. I'm guessing my guest is always maybe experiencing the same thing where he is as well.
Yes, it's the same here.
And my guest today is Andrew Garrood, who has been working in the digital space within pharma for over 25 years and actually was part of an expert panel at Smart Labs Exchange last week, where they were talking about exploring applications of emerging technology to accelerate innovation and transform the scientific lab. They always have such snappy titles for these panel discussions. So Andrew, thank you for joining me. It's lovely to meet you, my friend.
Thank you very much for inviting me.
Well, it's great. Well, look, the reason I've invited Andrew to have a chat is because he was on that panel last week, and we are obviously going to be talking about digital labs. But before we start talking about different aspects of digitalization within pharma, perhaps you could just give people a quick background of your experiences.
Yeah, sure. So, hi everyone. So I've been working in the pharma industry for just over 25 years. I started off working in the lab doing endotoxin testing, like my friend Alan Hoffmeister, and gradually got into doing lab automation and IT, and then started working for a big pharma for the past 23 years, doing a lot of projects from LIMS systems all the way through to complete digital labs and lab of the future projects.
Fantastic. So let's start with a really basic question, because everyone has a different view on this. But what do you define as, or what does a digital lab mean to you?
I mean, a digital lab for me is just a normal laboratory, but where we're taking advantage of digital technologies like tablets and augmented reality headsets, Internet of Things devices, and we're using those as tools to help people get their work done in a more efficient, productive manner than they would have done if they were just relying on sticky notes and bits of paper.
Right. Okay. And when you look at sort of digital labs, what do you think are the critical success factors within that to make them successful?
I think the most successful thing to do is to talk to the scientists and ask them what they need to do their job, and also observe the scientists as they go about their job. So I kind of liken this to a David Attenborough approach, where you sort of sit and watch the participants in the wild and see what they really do, because what people really do and what they say they do are often quite different things. And then you try and just make sure that you're providing solutions that will help them get their job done in a more efficient way. Then talk to their boss and find out what their boss says they think they do, and then match those two things up and hopefully make a more efficient, productive laboratory environment for everybody.
Right. And when you do that, though, I mean, and you sort of go through that process, what sort of obstacles can you face? Because obviously it's easy to say we'll just observe them and we'll talk to the boss on that, but do you have any barriers that you often face when trying to go through that process?
I mean, what I've found is that you need to work through the entire stack of technologies and processes in that lab space. So start off with the basics and just look, have they got space to put digital equipment? Have they got an actual network that can connect? Do they have a phone signal? Do they have Wi-Fi? Because if you're going to have a digital lab, you need these basic pieces of infrastructure in place. Do they have a fast network that's able to do the data transfers off of those equipment they've been buying in that just generate reams of data? Can they actually do something with that data, or does it just sort of sit stuck on the bench? And so then you work through the infrastructure, and then you look at what tools and processes those scientists are using and what they're doing in their daily work. And is the work they're doing amenable to digitization, and is it amenable to automation? It may not be. Don't bring tools in that are just there to look cool and a nice slideware for the company brochure at shareholders events. Try and make sure that you're finding things that are actually going to be useful for them. And then the other barrier as well is sometimes people sort of say, well, I've worked this way for many years, I'm happy with post-it notes and paper. I don't want to change my approach. And so you have to sort of help them understand how you can make their lives easier and more efficient. And I found that often the people who have been most against automation or technology often become the greatest advocates for it, because then they find that suddenly it's helping them be more efficient in their day-to-day job. We had a project a couple of years ago where quite a few people said, that smartphone you've given me, I'm never going to take it out of the drawer. It's going to stay in that drawer. I'm never going to use it. And then about 6 months later, they're pinging you at 9 o'clock at night with questions from their phone. It's got sent from iPhone. Like, I know you're not at your desk in the office. I know that you've done. So, they often become the biggest advocates of it, because you've proven that it's useful for their day-to-day business and it's made their lives easier. They don't have to spend their day chained to the lab bench. They can go and get a cup of coffee. And I think, scientists, especially in the UK, tea breaks are the most important things for them anyway.
Yeah, I think that's very true. I was speaking to someone, Cindy Novak at BMS this year about digitalization as well, and she said that actually one of the things for her to get digitalization within the lab was what you were just saying, though, is actually finding those advocates first and foremost,
Yep.
so that they can, like you said, be the biggest advocates about digitalization and get everyone else on board with what you're trying to do. Do you find that's important for you? So it's not so much managing up and getting senior management on board, although you obviously have to because they're the ones signing off on the budget, but it's getting people on the shop floor, if you want, or the lab floor,
Yeah, no,
on
absolutely.
side.
Yeah, no, I mean, you can get senior managers to sort of like come on board with the vision. They'll say something, we want to go paperless and we want to be more automated, etc., and we want to be digital. And then you go and find some people who actually, will have to live that. And so, yeah, getting together a group of people, like a board of scientists of different ages and demographics and aptitudes with technology, and then having a main point of contact who will then sort of like lead that little team to then interface with the technologists. That works really well, because on the last big project I did for this with the Lab of the Future was we found that we had a panel of people like that. They helped evaluate the technologies. You should always evaluate and test technologies before you try and roll that out into production. The worst thing to do is when a scientist is moving into a new lab and is highly stressed because they're trying to get all their equipment to work, is to then chuck some IT on top of that. So have a pre-move working group that then test the technology, and then be open that some of this will fail. Get them to test something out and say, yeah, we didn't like that tablet, that smartphone model didn't work, but then have them help you narrow those technologies down. And also the electronic lab notebook solutions and things like OneNote. And then they will then stand up at a town hall meeting and they will be the ones to talk about it. It's all very well me standing up and pontificating about technology and how great this is, but it works much more effectively if scientists from a lab does it, because then the people believe them because they know that that person works in the lab and they demonstrate how it's worked for them in a way that relates to how the scientists are working. So that's absolutely key.
Brilliant. And that leads on quite nicely, actually. Was talking about technologies, and so what are some of the examples that you've got of smart technologies that you're using within a scientific lab?
Well, I mean, there's lots of different ones coming along, and some of them, we're quite used to them in the consumer environment, but, just tablet devices, PCs that can be carried around easily, that they can be sort of like hooked up next to a fume cabinet or a laminar flow hood, those sort of things, because what they can do is they can provide you a surface on which you can write down or collect information at the bench, as opposed to the sticky notes and scraps of paper from the printer that you might be using, and or it just makes sure you don't get a soggy lab notebook as well. Then we're looking at other things like augmented reality headsets. So I think people are quite familiar with Google Glasses, but that sort of like fell by the wayside. But there are better technologies around, like the HoloLens. And what that can do is it can overlay information onto your environment about what's going on with an experiment, or you can be guided through an experiment. Someone can help you sort of do your pipetting series. So if you've got someone who's less experienced, they can be guided remotely by somebody who's more experienced. Or you can also have an engineer help you fix your broken HPLC machine, because they can just get you to do the work for them without them having to come in the office. And then other things like in Internet of Things, there's a lot of talk about that, and that's a very broad spectrum, but there's particular technologies in there like RFID for tracking where equipment and reagents are. That's very useful. You can do Bluetooth beacon tracking, which can sort of like orientate you within a laboratory or a building environment. So you can use that to triangulate a position and then know where someone is relative to a piece of equipment. Because the holy grail would be that you walk into the office, and as you sit down, it recognizes you're coming in close to the water bath, and automatically turns the water bath on. So by the time you get to the bench, the water bath is the right temperature. That's just a very trivial example, but that's the sort of thing you can do with this type of technology. The other one is single board computers. So I don't know, have you heard of the Raspberry Pi?
No, I haven't, no.
Okay, so the Raspberry Pi is a single board computer that's made by the Raspberry Pi Foundation UK. And it's really done as an educational tool, but what it is it's a sort of mini PC that's probably got the power of PC that you and I would have been happy with about 10, 15 years ago. But it's only like 35, 40 pounds, right. But allows you to do lots of automation and can collect data. And so you can have that hooked up to other sensors in a lab. And so that kind of thing is helping to create digital labs. And then, other more mundane things. At that conference last week, there was a very good presentation from Cancer Research UK, where they went through about how they're using tools like Office 365, etc., digitize their lab work. And we don't think Microsoft Office as being perhaps a digital lab tool, but it really absolutely is. I think all scientists are heavily into Excel, collecting all their documents in Word and OneNote, etc. So, that's another example, I think, of a smart technology that's finding its way into the laboratory environment.
Yeah, I mean, obviously Excel came into the news when they're using the old variant of
Oh,
Excel.
yeah, I think everyone
last
who's in
year.
IT, everyone who's probably in IT and scientific IT went, what are they doing?
I know we're not enough rows and losing the ends of it, but anyway. The pandemic last year obviously has forced lots of companies to move into digitization, and you could argue that pharma, by its very nature, being very conservative and very regulatory, has always sort of stuck to what it's always done, because one, they know that it's been approved, and two, they've just been slow in turning around. I mean, from your own experience, working, as an end user in Big Pharma, did the pandemic speed up digitization internally for you as a business, or were you already there in many respects in terms of what you needed to be doing digitization wise?
I think what it did, I think what I would do is I make a distinction between research and the development and manufacturing. Development and manufacturing a little bit more conservative, but research has always been a bit more cutting edge, bleeding edge with technologies they're willing to use, etc. So that's and it's interesting to see that a lot of that stuff is now moving into the later stages of the process. But the point about digitization and the pandemic, I think it was accelerating existing trends. So we already saw trends that more people were working from home. Scientists were less chained to the bench. Because they were able to do more things remotely, they were able to work on their database, etc., remotely. And I think what happened during the pandemic is many organizations, including the one I was part of, improve their infrastructure that would then allow you to take advantage of being able to work remotely with tools that perhaps a couple of years ago would have really chugged over the old modem. They work much more effectively now at home with broadband and the VPN solutions. So, people were starting to collaborate over Zoom and Microsoft Teams more than they ever did before. I think the biggest change was that, there was always be that one remote participant in any sort of activity, and everyone would go, oh, and George was on the phone, that conference speaker in the middle of the room, and suddenly everyone said, oh, bye, George. But that's sort of changed now. We're all in that situation. So I think it's just accelerated some existing trends. And I think what it's also doing is it's driving interest in more remote working technologies. So for years, we've had the ability to monitor equipment and to monitor experiments with webcams and other devices. But what we're doing now is we're seeing more people who are actually interested in making that a more routine thing, so that the whole lab environment has cameras on it, or all the experiments have cameras on them, or they've got sensors that mean that the scientist doesn't have to drag themselves in hungover on a Sunday morning to go and look at what's happening with their experiment. I think we can all relate to that, or relate to scientists that we know that have done that. And so I think it's just accelerated what was already happening, which is great, because I think now everyone just realizes how important and valuable that is. And it's not just a nice to have, it's now an essential to have. And I think also if the social distancing requirements continue as well, we'll see a continuation of people wanting to somehow monitor who's in a lab space. So again, there's always been remote worker tools, but they've been really sort of for people who are like down in the bowels of a building coming in on a Sunday morning to do something in the animal facility. I think now we'll see most of the scientists perhaps being able to have basically a remote worker tool on their smartphones. And I think smartphones for lab scientists is probably one of the biggest things that we can do to improve productivity in the lab. And so I'll make a big push there that if anyone's advocating digitizing their lab, get your team a smartphone first. I'm not on commission from Apple or Android for that. So.
And obviously you work with a lot of vendors. So, I mean, this is for vendors out there, because there's lots of them who attend all these conferences as well. What do you look for from a vendor, when you're choosing a vendor? Because, I asked this to Cindy as well, but I'm asking you because I think it's quite useful for them to understand what your needs are and what you're looking for out of a vendor as well.
I think the two main things I would be looking for is enterprise integration and usability. Time and time again, I've seen with different technologies, both in the lab space and the non-lab space, we've got great technology, but it is an absolute nightmare to integrate into a corporate environment where it can be logged onto a secure network, where the users can log in with their normal credentials, and where the security people are happy with the status of that equipment, device, software, whatever. Because so many times I've seen innovation technologies where it's just failed because we've just given up trying to get it to work in our organization. So really focus on making sure that it works in an enterprise and not just on your desk in the home office where you've got a great idea. And then the other one is usability as well. We still see a lot of devices and software applications that are really rigged for keyboard and mice input. And you really need to be thinking about the fact that everything else in the world is mobile friendly. You know, you want it to be tablet friendly. You want it to work with natural user interfaces. You want it to work with, you know, a variety of different devices without having the poor scientist trying to squint onto like a 10-inch screen to try and work out how to move a little mouse cursor to enter a data in a cell. You know, that needs to be moved away. You know, my advice would be look at the airline applications, not that we use them a lot these days, but look how good EasyJet's app is and how British Airways app is to use and how it integrates different types of technology like Bluetooth beacons and AR, and just usability, user interface design to give people a really great experience.
Fantastic. Thank you. Well, I hope the vendors who are watching take that on board. I always want to make everybody's life easier, both yours and theirs, you see. So that's why I thought I'd ask that question. Now, you talked about a bit earlier some of the technologies you use in the lab. So what are your thoughts on voice assistants in the lab?
So I think voice assistants have an interesting role to play. I think they're part of a suite of technologies. I wouldn't just sort of say, yeah, okay, the world's now going to be a voice assistant. You know, I think it's going to be part of a portfolio of what I would call natural user interfaces for scientists to use. So that includes gesture, touch, pen, and voice. And I think, you know, I may have said this in the panel discussion last week, is for most of human history, we've used touch and sound and voice and gestures to communicate and draw. And it's in the last 40 years, it's all been keyboard and mouse. And now we've got the technology to help bring us back. And that's where I see voice assistants potentially being useful, because they can help, you know, prompt people to do things during experiments. You know, that the lab technician role has often disappeared from laboratories. And so that, you know, kind soul who would go around and tell you where all the DMSO was hidden and help you order things, and then just would give you feedback or say, no, Andrew, you don't want to be pipetting like that, which happened to me a long time ago. You know, you can get that from the voice assistant helping guide you through those experiments. And then you can also interact with it, and you can also say, okay, hey, let me know when my water bath is at the right temperature. Again, a very simplistic one. But, you know, that's where I see voice assistants helping. They're going to be, you know, I don't think it's going to be kind of like the only tool we'll have in the lab, but I think it's going to be, you know, another tool that augments the digital experience in the laboratory. And my other one that I have a theory about is that I think if the voice assistants can also incorporate Spotify, then I think most scientists will be happy, because every lab I've ever been to has always got lots of music playing in the radio, playing in the background. So if your voice assistant can also manage your playlist, I think that might be popular.
Well, you know, it seems flippant, but actually it's very true, isn't it? We're all trying to create an environment which we're happy to work in and make us sort of get through sometimes the tedious things that we might have to do by just distracting us while we still can focus on what we need to do.
Yeah. You know, and scientists often have both hands full, so a voice assistant can play a great role. And where a voice assistant really kicks in as well is if you then have it with an augmented reality headset or a headset like this. That's where it really starts to become useful, because you're then not annoying everybody with the sound of talking, and maybe you're not embarrassing yourself by shouting across the room quite so much. You know, it's just a sort of like a quiet conversation with yourself. But you know, people are more receptive to that kind of thing now than they were a few years ago.
And let's, you know, talk about data. You know, obviously data is, the amount of data generated within a lab is immense, and there's so many people I've spoken to who are creating solutions to help people manage their data, read their data, and so on. So what role do you think scientific data plays in enabling the digital disruption?
Well, I think the scientific data is, you know, where all the knowledge comes from ultimately, and that's how we end up with great products on the market to help save patients' lives. I think where scientific data would play a significant role is in making sure that when that data is being collected, that you add all the metadata and all the relevant information to it, and you do it in a way that's easy and seamless for the user themselves to do, without them having to write down every single bit of detail. And then I think that will then help the digital disruption, because collecting that information seamlessly will then enable greater levels of productivity in the laboratory environment, which will then, you know, that would sort of like fall under the digital disruption, because now that would integrate with all the great devices and tools we're using and the great infrastructure. You know, a great symphony comes together and we have music in the labs.
So my final question is, well, not even a question, is, so wrapping up, what would be your final thoughts, and what message would you like to give everyone out there who are watching this, who are looking at their labs at the moment to digitalize it, or looking at how they can develop those labs even better than they currently are?
I think my main advice would be to, if you want to play around with cool and new and sexy technologies, do that on the side in small pilot projects before you then really get into the real meat of doing a digital lab, because you don't want to be playing around with things when you want to go to productive. When you go into production in a digital lab, make sure it's stuff that works and it's useful, and make sure that it integrates into your organization and can be both used and supported by the organization you're working within, because otherwise it just becomes more IT junk in the corner. I think, the digital whiteboards are sometimes a good example of that. How many have you seen of those piled up in corners of offices? And so I think, my message would be, make sure that what you're doing integrates into your environment safely, securely, and usefully. Make sure that it actually fulfills a need that the scientists actually have. Don't just digitize things for the sake of it, but make sure there's a purpose to what you're doing, and not just, digitize. Don't just digitize a paper process because the paper process, you want it to make it move onto an electronic lab notebook. Look at to whether that paper process is still required or not. Just think through what you're doing. Don't just do it for the sake of digitizing it and looking cool.
Fantastic. Well, look, I appreciate taking time out. For those who are watching, just to say, I only asked Andrew out of the blue last week. We hadn't even spoken before, and yet he's been kind enough to spend this time now sharing his knowledge and wisdom with you all. So I really appreciate it, Andrew. Thank you very much for taking the time out.
Oh, thanks very much for inviting me. Good to meet you.
No, it's lovely to meet you. So all that's saying is that if you'd like to know more, I'm sure Andrew will be delighted to see your comments below the video, and he's on LinkedIn, so you can message him directly as well.
Yep, of course.
So feel free to put comments below the video and get in touch with Andrew. And also it says, Andrew, I wish you lots of success in 2021, a happy, healthy, and successful year. And same to everyone watching. And as always, until next time, stay well and stay safe. Bye-bye.
Goodbye.